The cold, sterile glare of the fluorescent lights in the sacristy seemed an affront to the hallowed space, a harsh contrast to the gentle flicker of the sanctuary lamp just beyond the door. It was hours after it happened, and the air still hummed with a strange spiritual static, a resonance that no police radio or paramedics' hurried footsteps could entirely dispel. They said the blade went in, just below my ribs. I remember the abrupt force, a sickening lurch rather than a sharp pain, a kind of internal echo of the sacred silence that had been so brutally torn moments before. My alb, pristine white and crisp from the morning's pressing, had felt suddenly heavy, a funereal shroud rather than a vestment of joy. The expectation of blood, of searing agony, had been immediate, visceral. My mind, even as I clutched the elevated host, had registered the impending wound with a chilling certainty, a surrender to the inevitable sacrifice. It wasn't the fiery tear of flesh I had always imagined, but something far stranger, a sudden, profound absence where there should have been a grievous injury. It was as if the very air itself had become an impenetrable shield, absorbing the malicious intent and the physical thrust without transmitting harm. The police report, precise and clinical, documented it as a clear assault and attempted homicide, such stark earthly terms for an event that had felt profoundly otherworldly, a collision between the profane and the truly divine. Paramedics, their faces etched with professional concern mingled with palpable bewilderment, had confirmed the witnesses' accounts of the attacker's feral lunge, the terrifying flash of steel, the collective gasp that had ripped through the 212 souls gathered in St. Jude's. Their eyes, wide with a shared trauma, spoke volumes before a single word was uttered. They had laid me gently yet with an unsettling urgency, there on the cold, unforgiving marble of the sanctuary floor, a place usually warmed by the sun through stained glass saints, now laid bare to earthly scrutiny. The polished stone felt like ice against my back, a stark reminder of the material world's limitations. My beautiful alb, the very fabric I had worn to offer Christ's sacrifice, was carefully unfastened and peeled away, each button unclasped with a reverence that felt almost liturgical in its solemnity, exposing me, not just physically, but spiritually. It remained pristine, unstained by even a faint mark, its fabric smooth and unbroken, and beneath it, they found nothing, not a scratch upon my skin, not a bruise to mar the flesh, no furrowed red line, no broken capillaries, not even the slightest tear in the fine linen where the weapon, by all earthly logic, by every medical textbook and common understanding of physics, should have plunged. My breath caught in my throat as I watched their faces, a tableau of medical expertise crumbling before an impossible reality. The lead paramedic, a woman with kind, weary eyes that had seen much suffering, had pressed her fingers gently, almost hesitantly, over the exact spot where the blade had supposedly entered, her brow furrowed in utter disbelief. She murmured prayers I couldn't quite discern, prayers that sounded more like desperate questions to the heavens than petitions for comfort. That was the first impossibility, a paradox carved into my very being, defying every physical law I had ever known, every rational expectation I had built my life upon. It made the lead detective, a gruff but decent man named Miller, whose usual skepticism was his most defining feature, rub his temples until they were red, a silent testament to his profound intellectual discomfort. "Are you sure, Father?" he had pressed, his voice strained with a mixture of frustration and a nascent, unsettling wonder. "Are you absolutely certain you felt nothing?" And I could only meet his gaze with a bewildered shake of my head, because indeed I had felt something, but it was not the expected agony of steel. It was a pressure, a sudden void, then nothing. How does a man survive a knife to the heart without a mark? How does cloth remain whole when pierced by honed metal? My own mind reeled, grasping for a rational anchor in a sea of unreason, a theological explanation for this radical departure from the natural order. Was I in shock, hallucinating the strike, my mind playing tricks in a moment of extreme duress? But the collective gasp of the congregation, the frantic calls, the terror in their eyes, these were undeniably real, a shared nightmare from which only I, it seemed, had emerged unscathed in the most baffling way. For the first time, not in a theological text or a sermon's soaring rhetoric, but in the raw, undeniable fact of my own unharmed body, I encountered the utterly miraculous, a tangible, inexplicable touch of the divine. It was unsettling, profoundly so. It chipped away at the neat edges of my priestly certainty, not eroding faith, but expanding it into a terrifying, boundless unknown. This was no mere coincidence, no fortunate misstep by an attacker, no mere anatomical fluke. This was, I knew with a chilling certainty that both thrilled and humbled me, A deliberate act of divine intervention. But for what purpose? Why me? A simple, flawed priest in a struggling parish. Why this church, St. Jude's, so often forgotten? This impossible event was not an end, but a terrifying, awe-inspiring prologue to a truth so utterly defiant of reason, so profoundly unsettling, that it tore a hole in my understanding of the world, of God, of everything I had ever believed I knew. It demanded a new paradigm of belief, one far grander and more mysterious than I had ever dared to conceive. And then, the second impossibility arrived with the witness statements, a chorus of voices echoing the same unbelievable refrain, each word a further brick in the wall of the unexplainable. 212 parishioners, as I said, a cross-section of our small town, all gathered for Sunday Mass. Farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, the elderly with their lifetime of wisdom, and the very young with their unblinking honesty, each a unique perspective, yet each testimony converging into a single astounding narrative. Every single one of them had seen the man, a shadow, a palpable presence, a malevolence given form, a dark stain upon the sacred space, charged the altar. I had felt his approach, a cold dread creeping into the warmth of the Eucharistic prayer, a palpable disturbance in the spiritual atmosphere of the sanctuary itself, like a sudden drop in temperature. They saw him raise the knife, saw the glint of the blade catch the morning light, a brutal, horrifying spark of unholy intent, just as I elevated the host, during the consecration, the most sacred moment, when heaven descends to touch earth, when eternity pierces time. To have such violence erupt at that precise hallowed instant felt like a cosmic scream, a desecration that wounded my soul far deeper than any blade ever could, a wound to the very heart of the church. But here lay the truly baffling core of their collective account. Not a single person, not the sternest elder known for his keen observation and sharp memory, not the sharpest-eyed child whose innocence often sees what adults, jaded by the world, fail to perceive, could describe his face. Not his height, his build, his hair, the color of his eyes, the clothes he wore, nothing. It was as if his features had been deliberately blurred, wiped clean from their memory, or perhaps never truly allowed to register. They stood there in the aftermath, bewildered, shaken to their very core, some weeping openly, silent tears tracing paths on ashen cheeks, others silent with a profound awe that chilled me far more deeply than their fear. Their eyes, once filled with terror, now held a strange reflective light, as if they had gazed into something vast and ineffable, something that transcended the mundane act of identification. Each testimony, taken separately in hushed tones by officers growing increasingly exasperated by the uniformity of their non-answers, then cross-referenced by a team whose faces grew more perplexed and weary with every passing hour, returned the same impossible detail. They had been blinded, they insisted, not by the sun, not by a photographic flash, but by a light that was not of this world. And here, my own memory, previously clouded by the shock and the focused intensity of the consecration, began to clarify, to align with theirs, offering a more profound understanding of what had transpired. I had not been blinded in the same way. Rather, I had seen through the brilliance, perceived its source, witnessed its glorious, terrifying arrival. For me it had not been a searing whiteout, but a sudden intense revelation of form, of absolute presence coalescing between me and the attacker, a shield of pure, radiant grace. The parishioners, however, had described it as a supernova, exploding within the confines of our humble church, a divine flashbulb that scorched their retinas and burned itself into their memory, leaving an indelible imprint on their souls, yet left no physical trace on the sanctuary walls, no scorch marks, no lingering heat, just a collective, overwhelming spiritual aftershock, a reverberation of sacred power that left a tingling sensation on the skin and a profound silence in the heart, a silence pregnant with the unspoken truth of the divine presence. It was the hush that follows thunder, but the thunder was of heaven itself. A man lunged, a knife struck, no wound, no assailant's face, only an otherworldly light, a celestial barrier that materialized from the very fabric of prayer. It defies every law of physics, every rational explanation, every tenet of the mundane world we inhabit, a world I had, until that morning, understood and navigated with a priest's practical faith, finding comfort in order. They documented it all, these tireless guardians of earthly order, the police with their meticulous reports, the paramedics with their emergency protocols, the emergency room doctors who examined me with a kind of clinical fascination. Their professional curiosity piqued and found me inexplicably unharmed, perfectly whole, a medical anomaly. They closed the case as they must, unresolved, labeling it a file of absurdities. a bizarre anomaly that fit no human category, a riddle with no answer in their books. They left me with the facts, cold and hard and impossible, staring at the empty space where a blade should have entered and a face should have been seen, knowing that what had truly transpired was beyond their comprehension and, for a time, beyond even my own. But it was not beyond God. And now, burdened by this sacred, impossible truth, compelled by a spiritual imperative far greater than any legal oath, I must tell you what truly happened in St. Jude's that Sunday morning, and how it utterly changed us all, drawing us from weariness into an unshakable, miraculous faith. The police, with their notebooks and their theories grounded in the tangible world, could make no sense of the Sunday morning's events. But I, Father Michael, burdened now by a sacred, impossible truth, compelled by a spiritual imperative far greater than any legal oath, knew that the story they sought to close was just beginning. It began for me, not with the flash of an inexplicable light or the baffling absence of a wound, but with a boy named Leo Vance, a lamb I had failed to shepherd, whose broken heart was the crucible in which a miracle would ultimately be forged. Before his rage consumed him, before the darkness settled in his eyes and the bitterness twisted his young face, Leo Vance was, without hyperbole, one of my brightest altar boys. I remember him vividly, a slender wisp of a boy with hair the color of chestnuts and eyes that held an earnest, almost piercing intensity. He would arrive for Mass an hour early, his cassock pressed, his surplice starched, the scent of laundry soap clinging to him like a promise. He moved with a quiet, almost reverent grace around the sacristy, preparing the cruets, lighting the candles with a steady hand, ensuring the missal was open to the correct pages. There was a meticulousness to his every action, a careful dedication that spoke of a deep respect not just for the ritual but for the sacred mystery it unveiled. I can still see him, standing at the foot of the altar, his small hands clasped before him, his gaze fixed on the tabernacle with a reverence that shamed men 3 times his age. When it was time to ring the Sanctus bells, Leo would hold them with a delicate precision, waiting for the exact moment of the consecration. His eyes, usually bright with youthful curiosity, would become solemn, reflecting the awe that filled him. Then, with a gentle, rhythmic cadence, he would sound the chimes, each bell a clear, resonant note rising into the hushed air of St. Jude's, marking the moment when heaven touched earth. It wasn't just a duty for Leo. It was a profound act of devotion, a participation in something truly holy. He understood, in a way many adults never quite grasped, the profound truth of the Eucharist, that silent, astounding miracle offered anew each day. He believed. Oh, how he believed. His faith was a vibrant, visible thing, a beacon in our often weary parish. He served not just on Sundays but for daily Mass, for funerals, for weddings. He was always there, a quiet, dependable presence, a testament to the uncomplicated, unburdened faith of a child. I often thought of him as a young Saint Tarcisius, fiercely protective of the Blessed Sacrament, eager to serve, hungry for God. His parents, good, hard-working people, were proud, and rightly so. They saw in Leo the fruits of their own devotion, a testament to the spiritual legacy they were passing on. I saw in him the future of St. Jude's, a young soul aflame with God's love. But then, the fire died, or rather, it was smothered by the chilling hand of sorrow. It began subtly, as these things often do, a whisper of a cough, a flushed cheek, a fever that came on fast and furious, like a storm breaking without warning. Maria, Leo's little sister, a sprite of a girl with a laugh that tinkled like the very Sanctus bells her brother rang, had always been a delicate child, prone to colds. But this was different. This was a malevolent force, swift and merciless. I remember the call from Mrs. Vance late one Thursday night, her voice thin with terror, telling me Maria's temperature was soaring, that she was struggling to breathe. I rushed to the hospital, praying without ceasing, my rosary beads worn smooth in my agitated hands. I sat with them in that sterile, fluorescent-lit waiting room, the air thick with the hushed dread that only a hospital at night can conjure. I saw the fear etched on Mr. Vance's face, the desperate hope in Mrs. Vance's eyes as she clutched a worn crucifix. And then there was Leo. He was only 12, but he sat perfectly still, his hands clasped, just as he would at the altar, his eyes fixed, not on a tabernacle, but on the closed door, behind which Maria fought for her life. He was praying, I knew, with every fiber of his being, with the fierce, unshakable conviction of a boy who believed his prayers moved mountains, who had seen God's presence in a piece of bread. He had prayed harder, more fervently than any of us. For 2 days, we waited, we prayed, we hoped. The doctors did what they could, their faces grim. And then, on a Friday afternoon, as the slanting sun cast long shadows across the hospital floor, The doctor emerged from Maria's room, his expression grave, his words delivered in a soft, clinical monotone that nonetheless struck like a hammer blow. Maria was gone, a viral encephalitis, aggressive and untreatable. There was nothing more to be done. The wail that tore from Mrs. Vance's throat was a sound I will carry with me to my grave, a mother's primal scream of loss tearing at the fabric of existence. Mr. Vance, a man of quiet strength, simply crumbled, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs, but it was Leo's reaction that pierced me most deeply. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply stood up, his small body rigid, his eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on the doctor, then on his parents, and finally, with a slow, deliberate movement, on me. There was a question in those eyes, a silent, searing accusation that stripped me bare. Where was God, Father? Where was the miracle? I sat with them in the following days, in the suffocating stillness of their home, where Maria's laughter once echoed. I held their hands. I offered the cold comfort of theology, words about God's mysterious plan, about suffering, about the promise of resurrection, but the words felt hollow, inadequate. What could I say to a mother whose arms ached to hold her child, to a father whose dreams for his daughter lay shattered? What comfort could I offer to a boy who had poured out his heart to heaven, only to be met with a deafening silence? I spoke of faith, of hope, of enduring love, but it was like offering a cup of water to a soul dying of thirst in a desert. They wanted a miracle, a reversal, a return to what was. And when no miracle came, when Maria remained stubbornly, heartbreakingly gone, that silence from heaven became, for Leo, a personal betrayal. He had offered everything, his devotion, his trust, his pure, innocent heart, and he felt he had been given nothing in return. The change in Leo was not immediate, but it was inexorable, like the slow creep of winter after a vibrant autumn. He stopped coming to daily mass. He stopped volunteering to serve. When I saw him in the pews on Sunday, which became less and less frequent, he no longer wore his cassock. He wore jeans and a hooded sweatshirt, his shoulders hunched, his head bowed, but not in prayer. It was a posture of withdrawal, of defiance. His once earnest face, once so open and guileless, began to harden. The meticulous altar boy who moved with such grace was replaced by a sullen, brooding youth. The light in his eyes, which had reflected the awe of the Eucharist, was extinguished, replaced by a festering anger, a smoldering resentment that radiated from him like a palpable heat. He traded his cassock for a scowl, a permanent fixture that seemed carved into his features. His faith, once so vibrant and strong, he traded for a bitter, corrosive doubt, a furious rejection. It wasn't just doubt, however. It was an active, seething anger directed squarely at the God he believed had abandoned him, and by extension, at the priest who served that God, who had spoken empty words when he should have conjured a miracle. I tried to reach him. I sought him out after Mass, tried to speak to him gently, to offer a listening ear, to remind him of the love that still surrounded him. But he would either stare through me with cold, distant eyes or turn abruptly and walk away, leaving me standing alone in the narthex, the weight of his anger pressing down on me. I saw the pain beneath the rage, the profound wound of a child who felt utterly betrayed by the very source of his deepest hope. He wasn't just angry, he was heartbroken, and that heartbreak had curdled into a dangerous, corrosive poison. This wasn't just about a boy losing his faith, it was about a soul in torment, flailing in the dark, pushing away the very hands that sought to pull him back to shore. And I, his pastor, felt a profound, aching helplessness. I had offered theology, sympathy, presence, but none of it had been enough to bridge the chasm that had opened in Leo's soul. I had witnessed his descent, from light to shadow, from earnest reverence to bitter contempt. He was no longer the lamb I could shepherd. He had become a lost, wounded wolf, circling the edges of the flock, his eyes burning with a pain so deep it threatened to consume him, and perhaps, eventually, even me. This was the true impossibility, the real gnawing mystery that haunted me long before the paramedics arrived that Sunday morning. The mystery of a heart so broken it could turn against the very light it once adored. The mystery of a heart so broken it could turn against the very light it once adored. A spirit so consumed by grief and anger that it sought to lash out at the sacred. This was a burden that weighed heavily on my own, a quiet ache that throbbed deep within my chest beneath my worn cassock. It wasn't merely a sorrow for Leo, though that was profound, but a broader, unspoken weariness that had settled over St. Jude's, our beloved parish. This young man's despair felt like a concentrated expression of the collective spiritual drought my flock had been enduring, a raw nerve exposed in the body of our community. Our parish, named for the patron of lost causes, had always been a haven, a beacon for the hopeful and the desperate alike. It was an outpost where prayers, often whispered with the raw, trembling certainty that if anywhere, here one might find a hearing for the impossible, rose like incense to the rafters. I had always loved that about St. Jude's, the resilience etched into its very foundations, the quiet defiance of despair that permeated its old stones and resonated through its creaking pews. I remembered the first time I knelt here as a young priest, feeling the cool, smooth marble beneath my knees, inhaling the mingled scents of old wood, beeswax, and sacred incense. It was a place alive with history, with the echoes of generations of fervent petitions, of tears shed, and thanks given. There was a palpable sense of hope that clung to the air, a belief in the improbable, the miraculous. But in recent years, something had shifted, a subtle but pervasive pallor that dimmed even the vibrant hues of our stained glass windows. Where once the morning sun had burst forth in a kaleidoscope of ruby reds and sapphire blues, now the light seemed muted, veiled by an invisible film of sadness. It was as if the very air inside our hallowed walls had grown heavy, thick with the unsaid, the unmet, the unresolved prayers that hung like an invisible shroud. I felt it not just in the hushed silence between hymns, but in the subtle chill that seemed to seep into the sacristy even on a warm day, a spiritual draft that raised gooseflesh on my arms. I saw it, with a pastoral eye that had grown increasingly attuned to unspoken grief every Sunday morning, reflected in the faces that turned to me from the pews. They were good people, salt of the earth, men and women who had toiled hard and prayed harder, their lives a testament to endurance. Yet the furrows on their brows seemed etched deeper now, like ancient riverbeds carved by relentless currents of worry, and the lines around their eyes less from the joyful crinkling of laughter and more from perpetual strain, sleepless nights, and the effort of simply carrying on. Their shoulders, which once seemed broad and capable, now often appeared stooped, as if under an invisible weight. I'd watch them walk slowly to communion, their heads bowed, and feel a profound compassion welling within me, a deep empathy for the sheer exhaustion I saw reflected in their movements. My heart would ache, wondering how I could possibly ease such burdens with mere words, when what they needed was a tangible sign of God's active presence. The economic landscape of our little town had withered over the past decade. The old mill, which had been the heartbeat of our community for generations, stood silent and skeletal at the edge of town, its windows broken, its vast parking lot choked with weeds. Its closure had left behind a gaping vacuum that no new enterprise seemed eager to fill, only the echoes of long-gone industry. Our young people, once the vibrant promise of our future, were steadily moving away, lured by the siren song of bigger cities and brighter prospects, leaving behind aging parents and grandparents, and a dwindling pool of youthful energy. Each departure was a small tear in the carefully woven fabric of our community, a quiet lament that echoed in the increasingly empty spaces of our Sunday school classrooms. I would sometimes walk past those classrooms, usually bustling with the joyful chaos of children, now quiet and still, dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight that pierced the grimy windows, falling on overturned crayons and forgotten picture books. The silence there was a stark, poignant reminder of what we were losing. I remembered Mrs. O'Malley, her hands gnarled with a lifetime of honest labor, the veins like tangled roots beneath her thin skin. Her voice, once a clear, resonant soprano in our choir, was now a shaky whisper, a ghost of its former self. She'd always greeted me after Mass with a fierce hug and a hearty joke, her eyes twinkling with a life force that seemed indomitable. But lately, her smile seemed to falter, a brave, fragile thing that barely reached her eyes, which now held a distant, almost frightened look. Her gaze would drift unfocused over the faces in the vestibule, searching perhaps for a connection to a past that felt increasingly out of reach. Her grandson, Daniel, who used to serve beside Leo at the altar, his small hands carefully holding the cruets, had left for Texas a year ago, searching for work in the distant oil fields. "It's good, Father," she'd tell me, her grip on my arm tight, almost painfully so, as if clinging to a lifeline. "He's making a life for himself." But her gaze would inevitably drift to the vacant space in the third pew where he used to sit, a small worn indentation on the polished wood. In that unspoken gesture, in the tremor of her voice, I could feel the profound, unspoken sorrow, the ache of a family scattered by the winds of economic necessity, a legacy fractured, a quiet loneliness that resonated with my own. It wasn't just the economic strain that hollowed them out. It was the spiritual cost of constant striving with so little tangible reward, the ceaseless effort without visible fruit. The faith of my flock, I observed with a pang that twisted my stomach, felt less like a vibrant leaping flame that illuminated their path and warmed their souls, and more like a stubborn, embers-deep habit. A well-worn path they continued to tread because it was the only one they knew, a ritual performed out of ingrained loyalty more than fervent expectation. It was a lifeline they clung to, even when it felt frayed and thin, rather than a joyful embrace of divine presence. They came to Mass. They received communion. They offered their intentions in low, sometimes halting voices. But there was a quiet desperation that hummed beneath the ritual, like a barely perceptible current. It was not the fervent plea of profound hope that once characterized their prayers, but the weary endurance of those who felt their pleas were met with an echoing silence, a vast, indifferent void where they expected a response. The very silence of the sanctuary, once a space of peace and contemplation, now seemed to deepen their sense of isolation. The collection plates, once generously filled with the crisp rustle of larger bills, now showed the stark reality of their struggles. A few crumpled dollar bills, mostly coins, small copper and silver circles that clinked sadly, a visible testament to the shrinking resources and growing anxieties that permeated every aspect of their lives. I would sometimes look at those plates, heavy with the weight of sacrifice, and feel a surge of gratitude for their faithfulness, mixed with a profound sadness for their struggle. And then there was the church roof. I knew with a growing sense of dread that it desperately needed repair, a structural necessity that felt like a powerful, painful metaphor for the spiritual gaps opening up in our community, the places where the elements, both physical and spiritual, were starting to seep in. There were visible stains on the ceiling tiles, faint at first, but slowly spreading like dark, ominous clouds, and during heavy downpours, the telltale drip of water would sometimes interrupt the quiet of the Mass, necessitating a hastily placed bucket. Every strong gust of wind that whistled through the aging eaves, every heavy rain that beat against the decaying shingles, brought a fresh wave of anxiety about the structural integrity of our sacred home, reflecting the quiet, gnawing fear about the crumbling foundations of faith in many hearts. How could I ask them for more when they had so little to give? And yet, the very roof above their heads, protecting them from the storm, was in peril. The spiritual exhaustion was palpable, a collective sigh breathed into the hallowed air during the liturgy. I could hear it in the hesitant, almost whispered responses during the prayers of the faithful, in the almost imperceptible dragging of feet as they walked, one by one, to receive the Eucharist, their movements slower, heavier than before. They were good people, as I said, clinging to ritual not out of blind adherence, but because it was their last, best hope for connection, for meaning, for a touchstone in a world that felt increasingly chaotic and indifferent. They were praying, yes, but often it felt like they were praying for a sign, a glimmer, anything to suggest that their struggles were seen, that their quiet endurance was not forgotten by the divine. They needed to know they were not just names in a parish register, or faces in the pews, but beloved children whose pain mattered, whose sacrifices were noted, whose tears were gathered. They needed affirmation that the God they had served so faithfully still cared. I would stand at the altar, holding up the host, the very body of Christ, his presence a profound mystery within my hands, and look out at their faces, each etched with its own story of struggle. There was Mrs. Petrova, her husband ailing, his breath growing shallower with each passing week, her medical bills mounting like a mountainous wave threatening to engulf her small home. There was Mr. Henderson, his farm teetering on the brink of foreclosure, the land that had sustained his family for generations now a source of unending anxiety, and the young mothers, their eyes shadowed with worry for their children's futures, grappling with the impossible task of raising hope in a hopeless environment. They wanted to believe, they tried so hard, clinging to the remnants of their faith, but life had chipped away at their certainty, leaving behind a raw, exposed vulnerability, a deep and aching need. They were waiting for rain, not just for their parched fields, but a downpour of grace to quench the parched earth of their souls, to wash away the dust of disillusionment and allow something new, something vibrant, to grow within them again. My homilies, I confess, felt inadequate sometimes. I spoke of perseverance, of hope, of God's abiding love, of the mysterious ways of providence, but the words seemed to bounce off the invisible wall of their accumulated burdens, falling flat and hollow. How do you tell a man who's lost his job after 30 years to simply have faith? How do you comfort a woman who buries her child with platitudes about God's plan? I saw their longing, their silent plea for something tangible, something undeniably real to confirm that the divine hand was indeed still at work in their weary world, not just in ancient scriptures, but here, now, in their broken lives. They needed more than words. They needed an experience. They needed to see God move. My own faith, though steadfast, felt insufficient to conjure such a sign, and I often found myself wrestling with a profound sense of spiritual helplessness, feeling like a shepherd with no green pastures to lead his hungry flock. This quiet, collective yearning was a constant companion in my priestly life. It permeated my solitude in the rectory, a presence in the quiet rooms, in the scent of old books and dust. It infused my prayers before the tabernacle, turning my supplications into fervent pleas for a renewal of spirit. It walked with me during my quiet evening strolls through the deserted church after Vespers, the only sound the soft padding of my shoes on the worn aisle carpet. I would run my hand over the smooth, cool marble of the altar, over the worn wooden pews, feeling the generations of prayers, of joy and sorrow, soaked into these very surfaces. But now, it felt different. It felt like a reservoir running dry, a spiritual well needing replenishment, and I, its appointed guardian, felt ill-equipped to find the spring. I often found myself praying, not just for my flock, for Mrs. O'Malley, for the Petrovas and Hendersons, but for our church itself, for the very spirit of St. Jude's to be rekindled, for a fresh outpouring of divine mercy to wash over us all. This broader spiritual drought, this collective thirst for tangible grace, formed the uneasy, almost suffocating backdrop against which Leo's personal torment unfolded. His despair, raw and volcanic, was a concentrated expression of the quiet desperation that hummed beneath the surface of our entire parish. He, like them, was waiting for a sign, for an answer, for a reason for the crushing weight of sorrow. But where their waiting was tinged with a subdued, enduring hope, his had curdled into a bitter, accusatory silence, a rage that sought to break rather than bend. We were a community, from the oldest widow clinging to the memory of her faith, to the youngest, most heartbroken boy who had lost his, all desperately in need of grace. We were a field parched and waiting for rain, utterly unaware that the approaching storm would not be one of gentle, restorative showers, but a flash flood of the miraculous, an unlooked-for deluge that would forever change the very landscape of our faith. The unlooked-for deluge, as I called it, had been building for some time, a pressure system of spiritual despair and unspoken grief that gathered force in the person of Leo Vance. It was not a sudden storm, but a slow, persistent cloud cover, dimming the light and chilling the air of our small parish. His initial acts were subtle, almost imperceptible to any but a shepherd attuned to the fragile nuances of his flock, to the subtle shifts in the spiritual weather. It began as a faint dissonance in the quiet rhythm of our sacred space, a jarring note in the harmonious silence of prayer that only a practiced ear might discern. I felt it first as a prickle on my skin during Mass, an inexplicable chill even when the sanctuary was warm, a fleeting shadow across my pastoral heart that I couldn't quite grasp. Leo's anger, a slow-burning ember fanned by a relentless wind of sorrow, had begun to spill, not like a sudden conflagration but like a corrosive acid, eating away at the edges of the very sanctuary he once held so dear. It wasn't a sudden, violent eruption at first, but a creeping, insidious presence, like a tendril of smoke from a distant fire, barely visible against the vastness of the sky, yet distinct enough to announce an unwelcome change in the atmosphere. I would catch glimpses of him in the back pew during Sunday Mass, a dark silhouette against the vibrant, jewel-toned stained glass depiction of St. Jude, the patron of lost causes, ironically gazing down upon this most lost of souls. His posture was stiff, unyielding, his shoulders hunched as if bearing an invisible weight, yet projecting a defiant resistance to the comfort of the holy space. His hands, which once so diligently rang the Sanctus bells and held the paten steady, were now clasped tight, white-knuckled or shoved deep into his pockets, symbols of a soul clenched against grace. Even from that distance I could feel the heat of his gaze. His eyes, even veiled by the nave's shadows, seemed to bore into me with an intensity that went beyond mere questioning, into the realm of accusation, of a profound and personal betrayal. They were eyes that had once shone with an innocent faith, now clouded with resentment, burning with the question why, that he could not voice aloud or perhaps believed had already gone unanswered. He never stayed for communion, never approached the altar he once served with such reverence, nor did he join in the familiar responses that wove our community into a single voice of prayer. He was an observer, a silent judge, his presence a palpable weight in the already weary air of St. Jude's, a heavy anchor dragging at the buoyant spirit of the congregation. Then came the whispers. They were faint at first, barely audible above the collective murmur of the congregation during a homily, like a serpent's hiss just below the drone of the wind. I remember it vividly. I was speaking on the patience of Job, the profound mystery of suffering, and the quiet dignity of enduring faith. My voice, I thought, carried the full weight of my own years of wrestling with these very questions, attempting to offer the balm of sacred wisdom to bruised and questioning hearts. I spoke of the hidden hand of God, of trust in the face of desolation, of the cross as a symbol of hope. But from the back, from the very pew where Leo lurked, a low, guttural sound would emerge, a scoff, a derisive snort that would prickle the air, carrying just enough resonance to make a few heads turn, a ripple of unease spreading through the quiet reverence. It was a sound that spoke of contempt, of absolute dismissal, of a heart that refused to be consoled by platitudes or the hard-won wisdom of ages, a heart that believed such wisdom was a cruel lie. It was Leo. I knew it. A cold knot would form in my stomach, and I would feel a tremor in my voice, a brief falter in my carefully chosen words, though I would quickly regain my composure, my gaze sweeping the congregation, offering a silent reassurance that I was not deterred. The whispers were not meant for me alone, I understood, but for the very sacred truths I was trying to convey, a poison gently introduced into the wellspring of our shared faith, intended to curdle the communal trust. The unease it caused among the parishioners was subtle, a nervous shifting in the pews, a quick glance exchanged between spouses, a faint furrowing of brows. No one dared to confront him, sensing, I suppose, the raw edge of his grief which they too had known in various forms, a grief that commanded a fearful respect, but it was a disruption, a quiet violation of the peace, and it chipped away, slowly, insidiously, at the fragile edifice of their communal prayer, leaving behind tiny cracks in the foundations of our shared spiritual home. The subtle disruptions escalated, like stones thrown into a still pond, each ripple growing wider, more insistent. One afternoon, after daily mass, a small group of faithful had lingered to pray the rosary, their voices a soft, melodic hum that filled the church with a comforting echo. The air was peaceful, carrying the lingering scent of incense and beeswax candles, a gentle repose after the day's liturgy. As I walked towards the sacristy preparing to lock the doors, the sharp resounding thud from the narthex made me jump, the sound echoing unnaturally in the sudden silence that followed. It was the sound of heavy oak doors shuddering under a violent impact, followed by a lighter, scattering noise on the marble floor, a sound I instantly recognized as pages rustling against stone. My heart sank even before I turned the corner, a familiar dread coiling in my gut. There, lying splayed and broken-spined on the cold, unforgiving stone, was one of our older missals, its gilded pages crinkled, its cover bent inward from the force of impact, like a small, vulnerable creature mortally wounded. It was a thick, well-worn book, a compendium of prayers, scripture, and sacred rites, a beloved companion to countless generations of parishioners, a tangible symbol of the very Word of God, of Christ's enduring presence among us. Someone had hurled it, not gently placed it. The deliberate violence of the act was unmistakable. My hand trembled as I picked it up, feeling the substantial weight of the book, and the heavier, crushing weight of the intent behind its destruction. The anger was no longer merely whispered, it was cast, physically manifest, against the very threshold of our faith, an open declaration of war on the sacred. I cradled the missal like a wounded bird, my fingers gently tracing the torn pages, dusting off invisible motes, my mind already identifying the assailant with a sickening certainty. Who else but Leo, consumed by a rage that could desecrate even the holiest of objects, and yet, who could feel such profound pain that he would lash out at the source of his former comfort, his previous solace? I placed it reverently on the small table by the confessionals, a mute testament to a soul in profound spiritual distress, hoping that its silent wound might somehow speak to him, or to God, in a language I could not. But it was the word scrawled on the front steps one misty Saturday morning that truly pierced me, a wound more direct and agonizing than any physical blow. I had arrived early, as was my habit, to prepare for a wedding later that day, the early light filtering through the budding sycamores, painting the old stone facade in soft hues of gray and gold, promising a day of gentle beauty. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of damp earth and new growth. As I ascended the worn, familiar steps, my eyes, still adjusting to the pre-dawn light, caught the stark, defiant white of chalk against the dark gray slate. In large, uneven capital letters, stark and unapologetic, were etched the words, "Where were you?" The question was a visceral punch to my gut, stealing my breath. It wasn't a theological query nor an intellectual challenge to be debated in a seminary. It was an accusation, raw and unvarnished, torn from the deepest chambers of a broken heart, laid bare for all the world, or at least for me to see. It was Leo. I knew it with an absolute, chilling certainty. a knowing that resonated with the ache in my own soul. The words were a distillation of the anguish he carried, the unanswered plea that had festered into bitterness, the betrayal he felt, not just from me, his priest, his spiritual father, but from God himself. How many times had I heard that question in the silent suffering of my parishioners, in the grief-stricken eyes of a parent, in the trembling voice of a spouse? How many times had I asked it myself in the solitude of my prayers, when confronted with the incomprehensible pain of the innocent, the seemingly senseless tragedies that plague our human existence? But to see it there, stark and public, defacing the very entrance to the house of God, was a profound shock, a brazen act of despair that reverberated through the very stones of the church. I knelt, not to erase it immediately, not to quickly cover the affront, but to look at it, to absorb its meaning, to let its desperate cry resonate within me, echoing the profound human cry for understanding in the face of sorrow. The morning dew still clung to the chalk dust, making the words appear even more poignant, like tears frozen in time upon the gray stone. Where were you? It wasn't just a question about Maria's sudden, cruel death or the crushing silence from heaven that had followed. It was a question about the very presence of God in suffering, about his perceived absence when his presence was most desperately needed, a doubt that gnaws at the roots of faith, threatening to uproot it entirely. And Leo, in his pain, in his wounded rage, had dared to write it for the world, or at least for me, to see, to confront. He was not merely expressing doubt, he was proclaiming an abandonment, a cosmic dereliction of duty. My knowing it was him carried a unique burden, a sorrow deepened by memory. I had known Leo since he was a small boy, an enthusiastic altar server with a face earnest in its devotion, his eyes wide with wonder during the elevation, his small hands carefully tending to the sacred vessels. I had watched him grow, had prepared him for his first communion and confirmation, had celebrated his innocent joy in the sacraments. I had seen the bright spark of faith in his eyes, a spark that had, by some cruel twist of fate, been extinguished by grief, choked by the ashes of sorrow. My knowledge of his past, of the boy he was, made his current actions not just vandalism, not just an expression of anger, but a profound and tragic unmaking of himself, a regression into a wilderness of the soul, a stark landscape devoid of hope or light. He was flailing, desperately against an invisible enemy, and each act was a cry, a desperate signal from a soul in torment, a message sent without words, yet profoundly understood. It was a language of pain, stripped of all politeness, all deference, all hope, a primal scream from the depths of despair. The whispers, the violently thrown missile, the chalked question, each was a louder, more desperate appeal, a deepening of his spiritual wound that he seemed intent on exposing to the very heavens he felt had betrayed him. My response was not one of anger or even annoyance, though the disruptions were certainly vexing, demanding my attention, fraying my nerves. No, my overriding emotion was a profound, aching sorrow, a deep wellspring of pastoral anguish. A pastor's heart breaks not for the inconvenience, nor for the disrespect shown to his person or his church, but for the lost lamb, the one straying further and further from the fold into ever greater peril. My fear, which settled deep within me, a cold, constant weight, was not for my own physical safety. The thought of my own harm barely registered against the terrifying prospect of Leo's spiritual peril, a danger far greater and more enduring than any earthly wound. I was afraid for him. I understood, with a clarity that felt both heavy and urgent, that Leo was in profound spiritual danger. This wasn't merely about losing his faith, though that was grave enough, a wound to the very essence of his being. It was about losing his very soul to the corrosive bitterness that was eating away at him from the inside, consuming his goodness, his capacity for love, his very humanity. This darkness that sought to claim him, as I understood it, was more than just human despair, more than a temporary lapse in belief. It was the insidious spiritual decay that sets in when all hope is abandoned, when love curdles into hatred, when forgiveness becomes impossible, and when the light of God is perceived as an enemy, rather than a comfort, a cruel joke, rather than a source of solace. It was the enemy of souls, subtle and unseen, lurking in the shadows of human suffering, waiting to claim those who are most vulnerable, most wounded, most adrift. Leo was an open wound, bleeding spiritual life force, and the spiritual predators, patient and malevolent, were circling, drawn by the scent of his despair. This terrifying realization transformed my nightly prayers. After Vespers, when the last golden rays of the setting sun would fade from the stained glass windows, leaving the nave in deepening shadow, I would kneel before the tabernacle. The sanctuary lamp, a tiny flicker of red light, was often my sole companion, a silent sentinel of Christ's enduring presence, a promise of light even in the encroaching darkness. The church would be hushed, a profound quiet descending that was broken only by the creak of old wood settling, or the gentle sigh of the wind outside, rustling through the leaves of the ancient oak. In that sacred stillness, in the quiet embrace of the holy, I would pray for all my parishioners, for the weariness of St. Jude's, for the tired souls who struggled, who felt forgotten, who questioned. But most urgently, most fervently, I prayed for Leo. I would whisper his name into the silence, sometimes a broken plea, sometimes a desperate negotiation with the divine, sometimes a torrent of words pouring from my aching heart. I didn't just ask for his peace or for comfort in his grief. I asked for his healing, for a restoration of the light in his heart, for a spiritual resurrection. I prayed for a softening of the concrete wall he had erected around himself, a wall built of accusation and unforgiveness, a barrier against God's grace. More than anything, I began to explicitly invoke the intercession of St. Michael the Archangel. My devotion to St. Michael had always been profound, a deep thread woven into the fabric of my own faith. He is the great defender, the captain of the heavenly host, the one who cast Lucifer from heaven, the formidable adversary of all evil. In our Catholic tradition, he stands as the bulwark against evil, the protector of souls, the warrior against the spiritual forces of darkness that seek to corrupt and destroy. As Leo's actions grew more desperate, more overtly destructive to himself and to the sacred, I felt an increasing, almost physical urgency to call upon this powerful patron. It was a spiritual intuition, a growing certainty that this was no mere human anger, but a battle for a soul, a battle that needed heavenly intervention. My nightly prayer became a fervent, unwavering plea, a litany recited with every fiber of my being. Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, cast into hell Satan and all evil spirits who prowl about the world seeking the ruin of souls. And dear Saint Michael, I would add, my voice barely a whisper, thick with emotion, I beg you, stand between this lost boy Leo and the darkness that seeks to claim him. Shield him, protect him, bring him back to the light. I would repeat these prayers, sometimes for an hour, sometimes longer, until the stiffness in my knees became unbearable, until my voice was hoarse with the earnestness of my petition, until the last vestiges of strength drained from my weary frame. I pictured St. Michael, not as a static stained glass image, but as a living, powerful presence, his spiritual sword poised, his gaze watchful, ready to confront the unseen forces that gnawed at Leo's soul, that whispered despair into his broken heart. I felt in those quiet hours like a lone sentinel, standing vigil, fighting a spiritual battle on behalf of a boy who believed he was utterly alone, utterly abandoned, convinced no one heard his cries. Each broken missile, each defiant scrawl, each whispered accusation solidified my conviction that Leo was not just lost. He was engaged in a battle he could not win on his own, a battle he didn't even realize he was fighting against true evil. He was adrift in a raging sea, convinced no one was listening, convinced no one cared to save him from the crashing waves of his own despair. And I, his pastor, felt the profound responsibility to call upon every spiritual resource available to me, to throw every sacred weight into the balance. The parched field of our parish, waiting for rain, now seemed to mirror the parched soul of this one young man, whose thirst for answers had turned to a bitter poison, whose grief had become a weapon. The approaching storm, I knew, was drawing closer, but even in my most fervent prayers for divine intervention, I could not have conceived of the magnitude of the deluge that was soon to come, a deluge that would not only quench the thirst of a weary parish, but would utterly redefine the very meaning of "Where were you?" That particular Sunday morning, a pall seemed to hang over St. Jude's even before the first notes of the processional hymn began to echo off the vaulted ceiling. It was not the usual hushed reverence, but something thicker, almost viscous, a silent atmospheric pressure that settled upon the soul long before it registered in the lungs. The stained glass windows, usually so vibrant in the morning light, seemed to absorb rather than reflect the sun, casting muted, bruised colors onto the worn wooden pews, like a prophecy whispered on the wind. The air indeed felt heavy, not merely with the weight of unsaid prayers, but with a palpable, unspoken tension, a static charge in the spiritual atmosphere of our little church. It was as though the very stones of St. Jude's held their breath, waiting. I had felt it even as I vested in the sacristy, the familiar ritual of alb and stole and chasuble feeling less like a comforting embrace, and more like a suit of armor against an unseen adversary. My hands, usually steady as I smoothed the fabric, trembled ever so slightly. The scent of old incense, prayer books, and beeswax candles, usually a soothing balm, today seemed to carry a faint metallic tang, like distant thunder. I straightened my cincture, adjusted the chasuble across my shoulders, and looked at my reflection in the polished wood of the sacristy cabinet. What I saw was not fear, not exactly, but a deep, profound weariness etched around my eyes, a shadow beneath the surface calm I strove to project. My parishioners, good souls all, were looking to me for strength, for reassurance, for the steady hand that would guide them through the sacred mysteries. And I, in turn, was looking to God, desperately. The deluge from the previous night's prayers, the one I had sensed coming, felt imminent now, hovering just beyond the visible veil. As I took my place at the altar, the familiar faces in the pews blurred into a collective longing, a mosaic of hope and struggle. I saw Mrs. Rodriguez, her brow furrowed with worry over her son's recent layoff, the young O'Malley couple, holding hands, silently praying for the child they so desperately wanted, old Mr. Henderson, his head bowed, still mourning his wife of 60 years. Each soul was a universe of quiet pain and resilience, and my heart ached for them all. I offered them a gentle smile, a nod of recognition, but my gaze kept straying to the back of the church, to the empty spaces I knew he often sought. It happened during the entrance hymn, "Lord, accept the gifts we offer," a hymn of humble surrender that seemed to mock the defiance I knew was brewing. A subtle shift in the light, or perhaps just in the way the shadows gathered, caught my eye. There he was, Leo Vance. He slipped into the very last pew, cloaked in a dark hoodie that swallowed his young face, rendering him a silhouette against the muted light filtering through the narthex doors. He didn't sit fully, rather he slouched, hunched, as if trying to shrink away from the light and the gaze of anyone who might see him, yet simultaneously drawing every eye to his defiant posture. He was a ghost haunting the back of the church, a shadow made flesh, and his presence was a physical weight, a chilling draft that snaked its way down the nave and settled in the pit of my stomach. My breath caught, a silent gasp that went unnoticed by the choir. My voice, as I greeted the congregation, felt a little tighter, a little more strained than usual. "The Lord be with you," I said, my gaze fixed on the crucifix above the altar. But my thoughts were entirely on the boy in the back, whose eyes, I could feel even across the expanse of the nave, were burning holes into me. I saw him, not with my physical eyes alone, but with the eyes of my heart, the heart of a shepherd who had watched a lamb stray and found her, a son of the parish who had been consumed by a grief so profound it had twisted into a venomous rage. We moved through the penitential rite, the communal acknowledgement of our sins, our failings. "Lord, have mercy," we intoned, and I thought, "Oh Lord, have mercy on this boy, on his pain, on his anger, on the broken promise of his youth." Every word I spoke, every gesture I made, was imbued with a dual intention, to guide my flock in prayer, and to send a silent, desperate plea across the sacred space to the boy who sat brooding in the back. I could feel the heat of his resentment from where I stood, a palpable energy that vibrated in the sacred silence between the responses. The liturgy of the word unfolded like a sacred drama, a recounting of ancient truths designed to illuminate our present darkness. The first reading spoke of Job's suffering, of a righteous man questioning God in his anguish, and I felt a pang of profound resonance. Here in the words of Scripture was the echo of Leo's own bitter cry, the "Where were you?" that he had scrawled on our steps. My voice, I prayed, remained steady. My hands, as I opened the lectionary, did not betray the tremor within, but my heart was a churning ocean of anxiety and fervent prayer. The psalm, a call for trust in the Lord even in the face of tribulation, felt almost ironic. How could I speak of trust to a boy who felt so utterly betrayed? I caught a glimpse of Leo then, his face still obscured, but his posture rigid, unyielding. He was not participating, not even passively. He was observing, judging, his presence a challenge to every sacred word being uttered. My homily that day felt less like a sermon, and more like a whispered conversation with God, and, through God, with Leo. I spoke of the mystery of suffering, not with glib answers but with an honest admission of our human limitations in understanding divine providence. I spoke of Mary, the mother of sorrows, who stood at the foot of the cross, her heart pierced, yet never abandoning hope. I tried to convey that even in the silence of heaven there is a love that endures, a presence that cradles us, even when we are too blinded by our pain to see it. I looked directly at the back pew, not singling him out but willing him to hear, to feel, to let a single ray of light penetrate the fortress of his grief. I poured every ounce of my pastoral empathy, every fiber of my priestly being, into those words, knowing that they might be the last chance I had to reach him before the storm broke. The silence that followed my homily was deeper, heavier than usual. It was not the reverent silence of reflection, but the taut silence of anticipation, of unspoken questions hanging in the air. The congregation shifted, some coughing softly, others bowing their heads in thought, but I knew that many, like me, were acutely aware of the simmering presence in the back. We recited the creed, a collective affirmation of our faith. I believe in one God, the Father Almighty. I believe in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God. I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life. Each article felt like a defiant stand against the encroaching darkness. I spoke the words with renewed conviction, praying that the very act of utterance might plant a seed of belief, however small, in Leo's hardened heart. My mind pictured St. Michael, shield raised, standing firm against the forces of doubt and despair. I invoked his name silently, a constant refrain beneath the formal liturgy. Then came the prayers of the faithful, where we bring our petitions before God. Each intention was a plea for mercy, for healing, for peace. I prayed for the sick, for the lonely, for the souls in purgatory, and as I led the assembly, my own personal prayer for Leo wove itself into the fabric of the communal supplication. Lord, save this lost lamb, heal his broken heart, show him your face however fiercely he resists. As we moved into the liturgy of the Eucharist, the altar became the focal point, the very heart of our worship. The usher and altar server brought up the gifts of bread and wine, simple offerings that would soon be transformed into the very body and blood of Christ. The preparation of the altar felt deliberate, almost ritualistically slow, each gesture a building block of sacred anticipation. I received the gifts, poured the wine into the chalice, added a drop of water, a symbol of our humanity mingled with Christ's divinity. I performed the lavabo, washing my hands as a symbol of purification, and in that moment, the water felt cool and cleansing, a brief respite from the burning tension. My gaze was drawn once more to Leo, still hunched in the back pew. He hadn't moved. He was a statue of despair, a monument to defiance. His eyes, even from that distance, felt like magnets, pulling at my attention, challenging my serenity. The air was thick with the scent of burning charcoal from the thurible, and I felt the warmth of the incense rise around me, a cloud of prayer ascending to heaven. The Eucharistic prayer began, the solemn invocation of the Holy Spirit. The Lord be with you, I said, and the congregation responded, and with your spirit. I raised my hands. Lift up your hearts. We lift them up to the Lord. The dialogue was ancient, comforting, yet today it felt charged with an electric immediacy. I knelt before the altar, my voice strong, but my heart heavy with the weight of both the sacrament and the human drama unfolding. I spoke the words of institution, the sacred words passed down through 2 millennia, the words that would bring Christ's presence into our midst. My voice resonated through the church, each syllable imbued with centuries of faith, of sacrifice, of hope. Then, the moment, the elevation of the paten, the thin, unleavened host held aloft, the physical manifestation of God's love and self-giving. Take this, all of you, and eat of it, for this is my body which will be given up for you. As I elevated the host, my gaze fixed on the crucifix behind the altar, on the suffering Christ who gave himself completely. My thoughts were entirely, unequivocally, on the boy in the back, the boy whose heart was so broken, so consumed by grief and rage, that he had chosen to make this sacred space his arena of confrontation. I offered not just the host, but Leo, his pain, his anger, his very soul, into the hands of God. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that he had not come to pray. He had not come seeking solace or communion. He had come to disrupt, to accuse, to demand answers from a God he believed had abandoned him. This was not a visit. It was an ultimatum. This was not a lament. It was a challenge. This was to be a confrontation, a collision of human despair and divine mystery. And as I held the consecrated host aloft, a silent, absolute offering, I felt the storm about to break. The very air vibrated with the unspoken tension, and I braced myself, not for my own sake, but for the soul of a lamb I could not shepherd, a child of God who stood on the precipice, utterly convinced that he was alone, forgotten, unforgivable. This is my body which will be given up for you. The words, so ancient and holy, passed from my lips like breath itself, carrying the weight of 2 millennia of faith, of sacrifice, of unending love. I held the paten aloft, the consecrated host glowing softly against the backdrop of the crucifix. not with any earthly light, but with the quiet luminosity of grace. My gaze was fixed on the sacred mystery, but my heart, as I confessed in the silence of my soul, was fixed on Leo. Even as I pronounced the words that transform bread into the living Christ, a part of me was praying a desperate, silent litany for the boy in the last pew, for the tormented soul who had once knelt as an altar boy at this very spot. I offered Christ to God, and in the same breath I offered Leo, a lamb I could not shepherd, a child of God consumed by a darkness that threatened to devour him whole. The church for a fleeting moment was hushed, suspended in that sacred breath between the human and the divine. The only sounds were the soft rustle of vestments, the distant drone of traffic from outside, and the beat of my own heart, which felt heavy, laden not with fear for myself but with a profound sorrow for the path Leo had chosen. I felt the collective yearning of my parishioners, a palpable wave of hope and weariness as they fixed their gazes upon the elevated host, each seeking their own measure of solace, of strength. And then, it broke. A sound ripped through the sacred silence, tearing at the fabric of the liturgy like a rough hand tearing silk. It was a scream, raw and visceral, a sound not merely of anger, but of unutterable anguish, of a soul flayed open and screaming its very essence into the hallowed air. It was Leo. My head snapped up, my eyes still holding the host but my focus drawn inexorably to the back of the church. He was a blur, a furious, desperate energy hurtling down the central aisle. His face, visible even from the altar in that brief, terrible moment, was not just a mask of rage but a grotesque contortion of grief and tears, mingled with a wild, desperate fury that turned his features into something unrecognizable. He was no longer the earnest altar boy nor even the sullen youth. He was a manifestation of pure, unbridled pain. In his hand, clutched with white-knuckled intensity, glinted the cold, unforgiving steel of a hunting knife. The polished blade, reflecting the soft glow of the altar candles, seemed to catch the very light of the sanctuary and twist it into something menacing. A collective gasp, a terrified, choked sound, rose from the congregation. It was a sound of absolute shock, of disbelief, of sudden, horrifying comprehension. Women cried out, their hands flying to their mouths. Men, rigid in their pews, began to stir, a low murmur of alarm rippling through the nave. But it was too late. He was already upon me. My parishioners, good souls who had come seeking peace, were now witnesses to a desecration, a violation of the holiest moment of their week. I saw Father Michael, their priest, standing vulnerable at the altar, holding not a weapon but the very source and summit of their faith. Yet in that profound, terrifying moment, I did not flinch. I did not move to defend myself. My entire being, every fiber of my priestly soul, remained focused utterly and completely on the consecrated host I held aloft. My hands, though they trembled with the sheer human terror that tried to assert itself, remained steady, cradling the body of Christ. To drop it, to allow it to be defiled, was unthinkable. My own life, my own safety seemed utterly inconsequential in comparison to the sacredness of what I held, what I was offering. A strange, unnatural calm settled over me. It was not a peace born of courage, but a surrender, a profound, immediate offering of myself to the will of God, whatever it might be. Here I am, Lord, I thought, a silent prayer echoing in the space where Leo's furious footfalls were rapidly closing the distance. Your servant, let your will be done. If this was the end, then let it be in this posture of offering, a priest holding his God before a world that had lost its way. Leo's arm, a blur of motion, was already coming back, preparing to strike. The knife, an extension of his despair and fury, was arcing towards my side, aimed for the very place where Christ's own side was pierced. I could feel the rush of air as he closed the last few feet, the heat of his anger radiating from him. I could almost hear the whistle of the blade as it began its downward trajectory. My eyes were still fixed on the host, an act of faith, a final act of adoration in what I believed might be my last moment. And then, as Leo's arm reached its apex, poised to deliver its furious blow, something changed. It was not a sound, though the sudden, profound silence that swallowed the screams of the parishioners and the sound of Leo's charge was itself an unearthly sound. It was not a flash of light, though the very air in front of the altar seemed to shimmer, to vibrate with an unseen energy. It was deeper, more fundamental than that. It was a shift, a profound alteration in the very substance of reality itself. The air grew heavy, thick, and resonant, as if the very molecules in the sanctuary had suddenly ceased their frantic dance and held their breath. Time, which had warped and stretched in the terror of Leo's charge, now seemed to buckle and fold in on itself. becoming something viscous and strange. The light from the stained glass windows, once clear and vibrant, seemed to soften, to diffuse, becoming less about illuminating and more about simply being. A profound presence, not physical but utterly undeniable, began to coalesce between myself and Leo. It wasn't visible yet, not in any defined form, but it was there. It felt like the sudden, absolute certainty that you are no longer alone, that a force beyond human comprehension has entered the room. It was as if the fabric of the world, woven of earthly matter and time, had been pierced, and through that rupture, something else, something eternal and divine, was gently, yet irrevocably, asserting itself. A silent, unmaking pressure filled the space, not of violence, but of an absolute, unassailable holiness that had simply decided to be. And in its quiet presence, the rage and the terror that had filled the sanctuary began, imperceptibly at first, to waver, to recede, as if consumed by a force it could not comprehend. The air, which a moment before had thrummed with Leo's furious charge, now felt thick, impossibly dense with that unmaking pressure. It wasn't the kind of stillness that precedes a storm, but rather the quiet that settles after all storms have been tamed, a profound and absolute hush that seemed to draw the very breath from my lungs. My focus, even then, remained steadfastly on the consecrated host in my raised hands, a fragile disk of unleavened bread that held the awesome presence of Christ. Perhaps it was this unwavering gaze upon the sacred that allowed me to perceive what was unfolding, not with my physical eyes alone, but with a deeper, spiritual sight. Where the air had been empty, now there was a shimmer, a ripple in the fabric of what we call real. It began as a faint, almost imperceptible warmth, a golden hue bleeding into the harsh fluorescent light of the sanctuary. It wasn't light from something but light itself, coalescing, gathering substance in the space directly between me and the boy who had sought to end my life. Slowly, reverently, like mist drawing itself into a solid form, the light intensified, shaping itself into an outline. It wasn't a figure made of flesh and bone, but of pure, incandescent luminescence, so brilliant it ought to have blinded, yet it did not. Rather, it seemed to illuminate the very soul, banishing all shadow, leaving no place for deceit or illusion. A form emerged from this glorious radiance. It was powerfully masculine, undeniably so, yet possessed no discernible features, no eyes, no mouth, no lines of age or expression, only the terrible and beautiful perfection of light itself. Imagine, if you can, a sculpture carved not from marble but from solidified sunbeams, imbued with an ancient, unwavering strength that transcended any earthly measure. Its golden white glow pulsed with an inner fire, a living presence that spoke of power beyond comprehension, yet it radiated an unimaginable peace. It stood utterly still, an immeasurable force of quiet certainty. It held no sword, no shield, none of the traditional armaments depicted in our stained glass windows, and yet its very presence was a weapon. It was a weapon that did not strike, did not rend, did not spill blood. No, its effect was far more profound, far more devastating to the darkness that had consumed Leo. The light it cast was not a physical burning, though it felt as though every atom of my being was being refined by an unseen fire. Instead, it was a spiritual searing, a divine alchemy that peeled away the layers of hate and rage that had encrusted Leo's heart. I saw it happen, not just with my eyes, but with a deep, intuitive knowing, the raw, animal fury that had contorted his face, the wildness in his eyes. It began to unravel, dissolving under the unyielding purity of the Archangel's presence. Leo, who had been lunging forward with all the violent intent of a broken spirit, now seemed to hit an invisible wall of pure grace. His arm, raised for the strike, froze mid-air, trembling not with exertion, but with an agonizing internal struggle. The hunting knife clutched so tightly moments before now seemed an alien object, heavy and meaningless. The light, gentle yet absolute, shone upon him, not judging, but revealing. It stripped away his defiance, his hardened resolve, leaving bare the profound aching sorrow that had been the wellspring of his rage. He didn't drop the knife with a conscious decision. It simply became too heavy, too discordant with the purity of the moment. It clattered to the smooth marble floor of the sanctuary with a sound that, in the immense silence, echoed like a gunshot, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Then, before my very eyes, Leo collapsed. Not from a blow, not from any physical force. He simply crumpled as if his very bones had turned to water, as if the weight of an infinite mercy, a mercy he had long believed was a lie, had pressed down upon him with an irresistible force. He curled into a tight ball on the cold marble, his head bowed, his body shaking with convulsive sobs. He did not cry out in pain or anger, but with the raw, guttural cries of a child who had finally, utterly, given himself over to grief. His face was turned from the light, as if even in his profound brokenness the full radiance was too much to bear, and it was then, in that staggering moment of divine intervention and human collapse, that I became aware of the congregation. They had not cried out a second time. Their initial gasps of terror had been swallowed whole by the overwhelming presence in our midst. 212 souls, frozen in time, their eyes wide with disbelief and awe. Then, as if moved by a single unseen hand, they too began to fall, not in a panicked rush but slowly, reverently, as if drawn down by an invisible current of holiness. They dropped to their knees, one by one, heads bowed, some weeping openly, others simply stunned into absolute silence. The whole church, from the elderly women in the front pews to the restless teenagers in the back, became a tableau of stunned, holy terror and awe. Every heart knew, every soul acknowledged that something impossible, something utterly divine, had just unfolded before their very eyes. The air vibrated with a palpable sense of the sacred, a silent, communal prayer of surrender and recognition. I, too, felt the pull, the urge to collapse, to prostrate myself before such an awesome display of God's protective love. But my hands still held the consecrated host, the very body of Christ, and in that moment, I understood my place. I was a vessel, a witness, a priest entrusted with the sacred, standing under the shadow of the Archangel, utterly protected, utterly humbled. I continued to hold the Eucharist aloft, a silent offering of praise and thanksgiving, my eyes fixed on the Archangel. The apparition held its place for a moment longer, a timeless span that stretched into eternity. It was a silent, absolute statement of divine protection, a testament to the truth that heaven is not distant, that God hears our prayers, and that his angels stand guard over his children. Its presence filled the sanctuary, saturating every corner, every soul, with its profound, unassailable grace. Then, as gently as it had appeared, the golden-white luminescence began to diffuse, to thin, to recede. It did not vanish abruptly but softened, faded, becoming less defined, less brilliant, until it was as if the very air itself had simply absorbed it back into its essence. One moment, a glorious, tangible presence. The next, only the lingering imprint of its holiness, a scent of ozone and something akin to blooming lilies, a profound, ringing silence. The church remained on its knees, silent, save for Leo's ragged sobs, now softer, less anguished, more weary. The knife lay glinting on the marble, the Eucharist still in my hands, and in that aftermath I felt a shift, not just in the air, but in the very foundation of St. Jude's, and in the heart of every soul present. We had witnessed the unmaking of violence, the searing away of hate, and in its place, the quiet, undeniable dawn of mercy. We had seen a miracle, not in the distant past of Scripture, but in the here and now, in our broken little church, on a desolate Sunday morning. And nothing I knew would ever be the same again. The sirens arrived first, a distant wail growing into a jarring shriek that tore through the fragile, holy silence clinging to St. Jude's like dew. It was a violent intrusion, a brutal return to the world's clamor, yet I welcomed it. The presence had departed, the light receded, but its imprint vibrated in the very air, in the terrified and awestruck eyes of my kneeling flock, and most profoundly, in the quiet, shuddering form of Leo Vance. I still held the consecrated host, my hand steady now, though my heart beat with a rhythm that felt both earthly and transcendent. Gently, I lowered the body of Christ back onto the paten, then carefully placed it on the corporal before the tabernacle. My gaze never left Leo, curled on the cold marble, his sobs still raw, but imbued now with a quality of release, not rage. The first paramedics, their faces grim and professional, burst through the narthex doors. They stopped short, their trained eyes scanning the scene, a church full of people on their knees, a priest standing unharmed, and a young man weeping on the floor next to a hunting knife. The lead officer, Sergeant Miller, a familiar face from our community, rushed to my side. "Father Michael, are you hurt?" he asked, his voice strained with concern. He saw the knife. He saw Leo. He saw no blood. I shook my head, a small smile touching my lips. "No, Sergeant, I am quite all right." He looked at my alb, perfectly intact, then down at the knife, his brow furrowed in utter confusion. The paramedics, meanwhile, were attending to Leo, their gentle prodding, met with only silent, shaking resistance. I knelt beside Leo, placing a hand on his back. He flinched, then leaned into my touch, as if the warmth of it was the only real thing in a world turned upside down. "He is not a danger," I told the officers, my voice soft but firm. "He needs care, not custody." They looked at me, then at the congregation, still on their knees, many with tears streaming down their faces, others simply staring blankly ahead, their minds grappling with the impossible. When they interviewed the witnesses, the stories, though varied in their emotional expression, were identical in their core unbelievable truth. A light, a figure, a sudden, inexplicable peace. They found no wound on me, not even a torn thread. The police report, when it came, would be a testament to the inexplicable, a stark admission of facts that defied all reason. I refused to press charges, of course. My only concern was for Leo's soul, for the deep cavern of pain that had driven him to such a desperate act. His healing began that day, not with a sudden magical cure, but with the painful, arduous work of confession and reconciliation. He spoke in hushed tones of the darkness that had haunted him, of Maria's face constantly before his eyes, of a profound sense of abandonment that had twisted his love for God into bitter hatred, and as he spoke, cradled there on the sanctuary floor, surrounded by the scent of ozone and lilies, he began, slowly, to glimpse the mercy that had never truly abandoned him. It was a journey, not an arrival, but it was a journey taken in the light, and our parish, St. Jude's, my beloved outpost for the hopeful and the desperate, it was reborn. The quiet weariness that had settled over the pews for so long was not simply lifted, it was burned away, purged by the fire of an undeniable truth. The spiritual exhaustion that had plagued us was replaced by a vibrant, fervent faith, forged in the crucible of witness. People who had drifted away, who had not darkened our doors in years, began to return, not out of habit, not out of a sense of duty, but because they now knew. They knew with a certainty that resonated in their bones, that we were not alone in our struggles. They knew that heaven was real, that prayer was heard, and that even in our darkest moments of rage and despair, when the enemy sought to claim a soul, God would send his angels to stand guard over us. They had seen St. Michael, a silent absolute statement of divine protection, a reminder that the veil between worlds is thinner than we often imagine. The collection plate didn't just grow fuller, it overflowed with gratitude and hope. The church roof was repaired, but more importantly, the spiritual roof over our souls was mended. We spoke less of lost causes and more of found graces. Every Sunday, as I held the host aloft, I saw in their faces not a stubborn habit, but a vibrant fire, a living faith that had been touched by the divine. We had been parched, yes, but on that desolate Sunday morning, the rain had come, soaking into the very soul of St. Jude's and nurturing a harvest of hope that would last for generations. We had seen a miracle, not in the distant past of Scripture, but in the here and now in our broken little church, and nothing, I knew, would ever be the same again. And for that, for the grace that broke through the darkness, we praised God, and we still do, every single day.